so the Indians would disappear. The blacks can't hear me. You can't hear?
Please come here. Can you raise your voice? No?
Not very well. Well, I'll speak as loud as I can. Can you hear me at Birzeit?
Yes.
Bring him a microphone. He can't speak louder.
It's very hard to speak louder. I'm sorry. Can you hear me in Birzeit?
The people here.
Yes.
The people here can't hear. Well, I can't help that. Yeah. Sorry, technical problem. The people
hear very well.
You can hear it. Birzeit. Okay, that's what matters. I was speaking of Thomas Jefferson's vision. The country would be free of red or black. The red Indians would be driven away, ultimately exterminated. Jefferson was in principle opposed to slavery, and someday he assumed it would end, and then it would be necessary to rid the country of the blacks who didn't belong there. They would be sent back to Africa. In fact, in 1862, when the Emancipation Proclamation was declared, the United States also recognized Haiti and Liberia for the first time, and the plan was to send the blacks there. Then the country would be free of blot or mixture, and in Jefferson's vision, it would extend over the whole hemisphere, so the entire continent would be peopled by a more noble race, as it was put. The Latins would go the way of the blacks and the Indians. The leading historian of early American imperialism, Richard Van Alstyne, describes this accurately. He says the idea would be to create a continent that would be American in blood, in language, in habits, and in political ideology. Now, the assumption was that it would be easier to achieve this in Canada, which was English-speaking, after the United States conquered Canada. As it repeatedly attempted to do, it was deterred by British force, but that may yet happen by the contemporary measures of neoliberal subjugation. Well, the first century of American history was a conquest of what is now considered the national territory. That meant conquest of Florida, conquest of half of Mexico, driving out or exterminating the indigenous population. That was pretty well completed by the end of the century, and then the United States began to move beyond. 1898, it conquered Cuba. It was called liberating Cuba. In fact, it was preventing Cuba from liberating itself from Spain. Took the colony of Puerto Rico, which it still holds in the Pacific, stole Hawaii from its population, went on to the Philippines, killed a couple 100,000 people, and turned that into a colony. And that was roughly the extent of the imperial power until World War II. One exception to this: by the First World War, it was became to be recognized that oil was going to be a commodity of primary importance. So Woodrow Wilson drove the British out of Venezuela and took it over, but within a few years, Venezuela was the major oil exporter in the world. That came under U.S. control and has stayed so until very recently. In the Middle East, the United States insisted on becoming part of the French-British condominium over Middle East oil. It took a piece of it. During the Second World War, there was a kind of a minor battle going on between Britain and the United States over control over Saudi Arabia. The United States, of course, won that conflict. The relative power was such as to ensure that. During the Second World War, U.S. planners recognized that the war was going to end with the United States in a position of incomparable global power. For the first time, it would become a real global power, not secondary to England and France. And they laid plans. This is the Roosevelt administration during the Second World War. They planned to construct what they called a grand area. The grand area would include, at the very least, the former British Empire, including the Middle East energy resources, the entire Far East, the Western Hemisphere, of course. That would be the grand area, and within the grand area, the United States, I'm quoting, would hold unquestioned power with military and economic supremacy, and it would ensure the limitation of any exercise of sovereignty by states that might try to interfere with its designs in the grand area. Well, by about 1943, it was becoming clear that Germany would not survive the war as a viable power, and the grand area plans were expanded to include as much of Eurasia as possible, crucially the core economic regions, Western Europe, Germany and France and the surrounding regions. So that was the grand area. It was taken for granted that a major problem would be to control the world's energy resources. The U.S. was actually the biggest producer by far, but it was understood that that's not going to last forever. And it was recognized that the Middle East had incomparable energy resources. Saudi Arabia was described by the State Department as a stupendous source of strategic power and one of the greatest material prizes in world history, the most strategically important area in the world, according to President Eisenhower a little bit later. One of the leading American planners, Burley, said that control of Middle East oil would yield substantial control of the world. And that was and remains a core theme of American foreign policy. While France was expelled from the Middle East by legal trickery, Britain was gradually, over time, turned into a junior partner. One interesting case remains relevant today was Iran. When Britain and the United States overthrew the parliamentary government of Iran in 1953, reinstalled the Shah, the U.S. government wanted American oil companies to take 40% of the British concession. They didn't want to do it because it just wasn't economically valuable for them. It meant that they have to reduce their liftings from Saudi Arabia, which was much cheaper and better. But the government forced them to do it. That's one of the interesting cases where policy was not just determined by concentration of economic power, which is the usual situation, but a state interest overwhelmed economic power and compelled the oil companies to take the concession. The state was acting in the long-term interests of American power. The oil companies are acting in the parochial short-term interests of the companies, and the same individuals might make different decisions as CEO of an oil company and Secretary of State, which is what happened then and is happening now. The American oil companies would be very and exploit its very considerable hydrocarbon resources, oil and mainly natural gas, but they're being prevented by the state from doing so because of long-term state interests. It's a situation that arises occasionally and gives some insight into how, one major concern all along, of course, was Europe, Western Europe. It was understood from the very early days that Europe, after it reconstructed from the war, would become a major force in world affairs. Its economy is on the scale of the United States, in fact larger, and it could follow an independent course, perhaps a Gaullist course, de Gaulle's